episodes. Do you fall asleep to them, or listen while showering, or maybe during a late-night commute? If you drift off partway through, no worries. Timestamps in the description will help you pick up the story tomorrow. This is soft science, never wild speculation, told humbly. And as always, stay curious. Stay calm. Now, let's begin. If you place yourself in the deep past, long before farming or permanent villages, before even the word Neolithic had any meaning, the first thing you would likely notice in the hands of our ancestors is not a polished axe or a pot, but a stone. It is tempting to dismiss that as a primitive beginning, a kind of trial run before the so-called real technologies of later ages. But the truth is far richer. Those early stones, chipped, shaped, and wielded with care, were not simple in their own context. They were revolutionary extensions of the body, signals of new ways of thinking, and perhaps most importantly the foundation for everything that would come later. If we want to understand the first toolkit of humanity in the Neolithic, we must first acknowledge that this was only the most recent chapter in a saga stretching back nearly 2.5 million years. The earliest tradition we know of, the Old Dowan, appears around 2,600,000 years ago in East Africa. These tools are often described as simple choppers, stones with flakes struck away to create a sharp edge. At first glance, they may seem crude. Yet, if you hold one in your hand, you realise they are carefully chosen river cobbles, struck at just the right angle to break predictably. They could cut meat from carcasses, break open bones for marrow, or slice plant fibres. For early hominins, these were not gadgets. They were survival itself. The fact that Oldowan tools appear not just in one site, but across wide landscapes shows that this was not the lucky accident of one clever ape. It was a shared knowledge, repeated and transmitted, the beginning of a technological tradition. After hundreds of thousands of years, something changed. By about 1,700,000 years ago, a new form appears, the Acheulean hand axe. Unlike Oldowan flakes, these tools are symmetrical, bifacial and refined. They required foresight, a sense of balance, and the ability to visualize a finished form before starting. Acheulean hand axes could butcher animals far more efficiently, dig into soil or cut wood. Their spread across Africa, Europe and Asia shows not just a tool, but a template, copied again and again over vast distances and timescales. For more than 1 million years, hand axes remained a dominant technology. That longevity alone tells us how effective they were, and it also hints at something more elusive, that humans and their cousins were not just using tools, but perhaps teaching each other how to make them, embedding technique within culture. By the time the Neanderthals flourished in Europe, around 300,000 years ago, a different kind of toolkit emerged. Known as the Mousterian, this industry shows a striking leap in complexity. Instead of focusing mainly on large hand axes, Neanderthals perfected the levallois technique, a method of preparing a stone core so that flakes of predetermined shape could be struck off. These flakes could be turned into scrapers, knives, or points. The process required careful planning, striking at precise angles and anticipating the geometry of the stone. It was, in short, the Stone Age version of mass production. Archaeologists often remark on how similar Mousterian flakes can look across sites, which suggests a shared knowledge system. Each of these traditions, Oldowan, Acheulean, Mousterian, was not an isolated invention. They represent steps in a continuum, a slow layering of ideas and refinements. To call them primitive is to misunderstand the ingenuity they required. And while we might be tempted to see them as stepping stones towards something better, it is perhaps more accurate to see them as adaptations perfectly tuned to their environments. A hand axe was as indispensable to a Homo erectus as a smartphone might feel to us. When we speak of the Neolithic toolkit, beginning after 10,000 BCE, we should remember that it did not spring from nothing. The sharp edge on a flake had been discovered more than 2 million years before. The idea of shaping stone into a standard form had been mastered in the Acheulean. The concept of planning a sequence of strikes, of thinking ahead in 3 dimensions, had been perfected in the Mousterian. Each chipped edge carried within it not only the mark of a hammerstone but also the accumulated memory of countless generations. What counted as a tool before the Neolithic was, quite simply, whatever could extend the reach of the human hand and multiply the force of the human body. These early stones allowed access to calories otherwise locked away, whether in marrow, roots or hides. They gave their makers an advantage in competition with predators. They were in many ways humanity's first experiment in becoming more than flesh. We cannot know if those early hominins recognized the significance of what they were doing, but looking back we can see the outlines of something unmistakable, a trajectory of innovation that would, thousands of generations later, lead to polished axes, sickles, pottery and architecture. The haunting question that remains is simple. Was this progression inevitable? Or could humanity have stalled with only flakes and hand axes, never crossing into the later inventions that remade the world? It is a question with no answer, but one worth keeping in mind as we follow the thread from stones in hand to the first true toolkit. If we slow down and look more closely at what these earlier stones actually represent, another dimension becomes visible. They were not only about the physical tasks they performed, but about the way they reshaped human thought. When an Alderaan toolmaker struck a cobble and produced a cutting edge, they were in effect externalizing their intention into the world. That stone became a frozen memory of their gesture. Each flake removed was a choice, and every surviving tool is a record of a decision made by a mind thousands or millions of years ago. This act of embedding thought into material may have been just as important as the meat it sliced or the wood it shaved. In many ways, tools were the first durable archive of human ideas, surviving long after their makers were gone. Archaeologists studying Acheulean hand axes have often marvelled at their symmetry, and some have gone so far as to call them the first objects of design. Unlike the more opportunistic flakes of the Alderaan, hand axes suggest that their makers valued form as well as function. The sheer consistency across continents, similar teardrop shapes from Africa to India to Europe, hints at a shared aesthetic sense, even if it was unconscious. For us, the difference between crude and symmetrical may seem small, but it marks a profound shift. To produce such shapes, the mind must hold a template, a mental image of the finished product. That capacity for mental projection lies at the core of later innovations, from cave paintings to architecture. The Mousterian adds another layer. Levallois flaking is often described as prepared core technology, but the blandness of that phrase hides its sophistication. The stone core had to be shaped with multiple careful strikes before the final blow released the flake. It is not hard to imagine how frustrating this could be. One slip, and the carefully prepared geometry was ruined. And yet, Neanderthals and early Homo sapiens repeated this process countless times. This reveals not only patience, but also a social context where such skill was learned and transmitted. These are not one-off experiments, but the work of communities where knowledge was preserved and improved. It is easy to view the 2 million years before the Neolithic as a static prologue, as if nothing truly changed until villages and farming appeared. But that does a disservice to the long arc of ingenuity visible in every chipped flake and polished edge. These early tools did not just keep their makers alive. They trained human cognition in planning, repetition, patience, and shared learning. Without that long apprenticeship in stone, the Neolithic toolkit could not have existed. And so, when we finally turn to the period after 10,000 BCE, we must keep these older stones in mind. They remind us that every so-called new invention rests upon an invisible scaffold of earlier breakthroughs. The first toolkit of the Neolithic was not a beginning, but a culmination, and in its edges we can still hear the echo of hands striking stone on stone in a world unimaginably ancient. When the final chill of the Younger Dryas receded, and the Holocene began around 10,000 years before the Common Era, the climate settled into a relative stability that the planet had not seen in many tens of millennia. Winters and summers still oscillated, but the wild lurches of Ice Age temperature swings became less frequent. Glaciers retreated, seas rose, and the landscape revealed vast new zones of forest, grassland, and river valley. For humans, this stability did not mean ease, but it did mean predictability, and that single shift opened the door to an unprecedented diversification of tools. The stone world that had once been dominated by hand axes and flakes began to fracture into regionally specialized toolkits, each adapted to the resources of its surrounding ecosystem. For mobile bands of hunters in the tundras of what is now northern Europe, This meant smaller, lighter microliths, tiny flint blades that could be slotted into wooden shafts or composite tools. For groups inhabiting the river valleys of the Levant, groundstone implements appeared, grinding slabs and mortars that could process seeds and nuts now abundant in the post-glacial vegetation. In East Asia, polished adzes and chisels emerge in the record, better suited to woodworking in the dense forests that spread as the ice retreated. These were not random innovations, but practical responses to changing worlds. When the mammoth steppe vanished, replaced by birch and pine, the same hunting strategies no longer sufficed. Tools became the bridge between memory and necessity, carrying old skills into new ecological realities. The idea that humans suddenly diversified their tools around this time can be misleading. Nothing in archaeology is truly sudden. Change is always layered and regional. But the Neolithic marks a clear threshold because so many of these regional experiments became enduring traditions, sustained over centuries instead of abandoned after a few generations. It was as if humanity collectively realized that the new Holocene world required new technologies, and then leaned into that realization with remarkable creativity. We see the first clear patterns of regional identity expressed not through art alone, but through the way stone was struck, polished, and used. A microlithic toolkit from Britain looks nothing like a polished stone toolkit from China, yet both emerge from the same global shift, the end of the Ice Age and the beginning of a climate that encouraged permanence. It is important to stress that this diversification was not simply about better efficiency. Many of these tools are more labour-intensive than their Pleistocene predecessors. Grinding a stone axe head smooth could take days, compared to minutes for a chipped flake. The very willingness to invest such time signals that humans were embedding themselves differently in their landscapes. A polished axe was not just sharper, it was durable, repairable, and sometimes carried aesthetic touches that suggest pride in workmanship. In a sense, these tools reflect a change in tempo. Life was no longer an endless chase after herds, but a more rooted negotiation with land, seasons, and resources that could be revisited year after year. So why here? Why then? Because the Holocene was the first time in over 100,000 years when people could trust that a valley full of wild barley or a forest rich in game would still be there next year. Stability is a relative term, but it was enough to shift the calculus of human survival. The toolkit of the Neolithic is thus not just a catalogue of artefacts, but a fossilised expression of trust in the environment, a trust that would slowly grow into the foundations of farming and settlement. Another way to see the shift at the dawn of the Holocene is to trace what archaeologists sometimes call broad-spectrum adaptation. During the late Ice Age, survival had often meant following a small number of high-calorie prey species. In North America, this was bison and mammoth. In Europe, it was reindeer and horse. In the Levant, it was gazelle. But as glaciers melted and ecosystems fragmented into mosaic environments, people could no longer depend on one keystone animal or plant. Instead, they began drawing sustenance from a wider variety of smaller game: fish, nuts, fruits, and seeds. Such diversity in food required diversity in tools. A hunter, who once carried only a spear point, now needed fishhooks, net weights, awls, grinding stones, and storage containers. It was this expansion of diet that sparked the expansion of the toolkit. The archaeological record captures this in miniature. Sites from the Near East, such as Oholo II, dating to just before the Holocene, contain traces of hearths, huts, and a bewildering range of plant remains, over 100 different species from barley to acorns. To process them, the inhabitants left behind basalt grinding slabs, mortars, and pestles. This is technology responding directly to ecological variety. In Japan, meanwhile, early Holocene coastal groups developed some of the world's first pottery, not yet for farming, but for boiling shellfish and acorns, a way of extracting calories from foods too bitter or tough to eat raw. Each region solved the puzzle of subsistence in its own way, but all show the same underlying principle. A world with more kinds of resources demanded more kinds of tools. At the same time, mobility patterns changed. Hunter-gatherers of the Ice Age often moved hundreds of kilometres in pursuit of migrating herds. With the Holocene's patchier landscapes, people began returning to the same rivers, lakes and groves season after season. Archaeologists call this semi-sedentism. You can see its imprint in the tools themselves. Ground stone mortars are heavy and not easily carried long distances. Their presence signals a willingness to leave objects behind in a camp and expect to find them intact the following year. Likewise, more investment went into house structures, storage pits, and communal hearths, all of which were accompanied by tools that suited less mobile lives. Another layer of change is visible in craftsmanship. Flint knappers of the Mesolithic and early Neolithic began experimenting with bladelet technology, striking long, slender flakes from carefully prepared cores. These were not the massive bifaces of the Acheulean, but delicate inserts that could be slotted into wooden shafts, replaced individually when worn. In some sites, archaeologists have found caches of dozens of nearly identical bladelets, suggesting standardization and even early forms of mass production. This reveals a different relationship to labour, making a stockpile in advance rather than fashioning a tool on the spot. Once again, the climate's stability encouraged planning, and planning shows up in the artefacts. One might ask why this explosion of diversity did not happen earlier, during other warm interludes of the Ice Age. The answer may be scale. Previous interstadials often lasted only a few centuries before the climate snapped back to cold. The Holocene, by contrast, stretched on, century after century, long enough for whole generations to grow up without witnessing sudden reversals. That gave human groups the confidence to invest in durable technologies and more permanent ways of living. In other words, the toolkit expanded not just because it could, but because for the first time it seemed worthwhile. And yet, behind all this innovation, there remains a note of caution. Archaeology only shows us what survived: stone, bone, and occasionally charred wood. The true breadth of early Holocene technology likely included perishable items, woven baskets, nets, clothing, shelters, that leave little trace. If we could see those lost technologies alongside the stone axes and grinding slabs, the diversity of this moment would appear even more dramatic. The Neolithic toolkit is therefore not a fixed list of artifacts, but a reflection of human imagination meeting a newly stable world. It may seem counterintuitive at first. For nearly 2 million years, humans and their close relatives had shaped stone by striking one rock against another, chipping off flakes to make cutting edges. The technique was effective, portable, and quick to learn. Why then would anyone take the time to rub stone against stone for hours, sometimes days, just to create an edge that already seemed achievable with a sharp flake? The answer lies in what people were trying to do with their tools in the early Holocene, and in how durability and efficiency began to matter more than immediacy. Ground and polished axes, which appeared independently across several continents around 10,000 years ago, represent not only a technical shift but a philosophical one, a greater investment in time and effort up front for longer-term payoff. Chipped stone tools, no matter how expertly crafted, have an inherent weakness. The sharpness of a flaked edge comes from its microscopic irregularities, but those same irregularities make it brittle. Anyone who has struck a piece of flint knows that a perfect edge can shatter with a single miscalculated blow. Grinding, by contrast, produces a smoother, denser edge. It is not quite as razor-sharp, but it resists fracture and can withstand heavy pounding. For people in the early Holocene facing denser woodlands as the Ice Age tundra retreated, that durability was transformative. A polished axe could chop down trees, clear brush, and shape timber in a way that no flaked tool could manage for long. In short, grinding gave humans their first true woodworking instruments. Archaeologists have found early ground axes across a wide geography, suggesting convergent innovation rather than a single origin. In Japan, examples appear as early as 16,000 years ago, among Jomon hunter-gatherers who likely used them for working hardwood in coastal forests. In Sahel, ground axes turn up at sites in northern Australia dating back more than 30,000 years, though their use seems to have waxed and waned depending on the environmental needs. In Europe and the Near East, polished axes become common in the 10th millennium BCE, just as forests of birch, hazel, and oak spread across the landscape. The simultaneous appearance of these tools in multiple regions suggests that grinding was not a borrowed idea, but a natural response to changing ecological conditions. The effort involved in making one of these axes cannot be understated. Experimental archaeology shows that it can take more than 20 hours of constant grinding to bring a rough stone blank to a usable edge, and even longer to polish the surface smooth. This level of investment hints at other shifts in society. People were no longer moving every few days or weeks. They had the stability to devote long stretches of time to producing durable tools. The very existence of polished axes is thus indirect evidence for more permanent living sites and more complex social organisation. Someone had the time to sit and grind, and others must have provided food and shelter while they did so. The finished axes often reveal care that goes beyond pure functionality. Some are symmetrically shaped, carefully polished across their entire surface, rather than just the cutting edge, and even decorated with grooves or subtle fluting. This has led some archaeologists to suggest that they carried social value, as well as practical use. To present someone with a polished axe may have been a mark of status, alliance, or respect. Indeed, ethnographic studies of more recent societies in Papua New Guinea show that finely ground axes were exchanged as prestige items, not merely as tools for chopping wood. It is not too far a stretch to imagine similar social roles for the earliest polished axes. Yet even if their making required effort, their use more than justified it. A polished axe could last months or years with only occasional resharpening. By hafting it securely to a wooden handle, early Holocene communities gained a lever of force unmatched by earlier flake-based tools. Tree felling, once a near impossible task with brittle edges, became achievable. Timber could be split for posts, beams, and eventually boats. In this sense, groundstone technology represents a turning point in how humans interacted with the natural world, no longer merely collecting from it, but actively reshaping it. And still, questions remain. Why do polished axes appear so suddenly in the record after millions of years of flaked stone? Was it simply the arrival of forests that made them essential, or does the innovation reflect deeper social change, perhaps even ritual significance? Were these axes independently invented multiple times, or did the idea spread along little-known networks of contact? The answers are incomplete, but what is certain is that the first ground and polished axes signal the dawn of a new kind of relationship between people, tools, and landscapes. They were not just sharper stones, they were instruments of transformation. What is especially striking about polished axes is how they fit into the ecological drama of the early Holocene. As the Ice Age ended, Europe and parts of Asia transformed from open steppes into heavily wooded terrain. What had once been wide grasslands roamed by herds of reindeer and bison became dense forests of oak, hazel, and elm. For people accustomed to a mobile life on open plains, this new environment required different strategies. Game was harder to track, sunlight was blocked by canopy, and new plant species dominated the understory. To live in this changed world, people needed tools not just for hunting, but for reshaping the landscape. The polished axe became the technological answer. It turned impenetrable forest into manageable space for movement, habitation, and eventually cultivation. Archaeological finds across Scandinavia illustrate this clearly. In southern Sweden, axe fragments from around 9,000 years ago show heavy wear along their cutting edges, consistent with chopping through hardwoods. Microscopic analysis reveals polish patterns that differ from those seen on tools used for butchery or hide scraping. These axes were not occasional implements. They were workhorses for clearing paths and opening up living areas. In Britain, waterlogged sites such as Starcar preserve hafted examples, where the axe head was set into a wooden handle using resin and sinew. The sophistication of these attachments shows that by the dawn of the Neolithic, the axe was not a crude experiment but a well-established, trusted instrument. Outside Europe, similar adaptations unfolded. In China's Yellow River Basin, polished axes appear in contexts associated with the earlier sedentary villages, suggesting their use in timber construction. The foundations of semi-subterranean houses point to systematic woodcutting, a task impossible without robust edge tools. In Africa, ground axes were discovered in Holocene deposits in the Sahara, from a time when the desert was still a savanna rich in trees. Here they likely played a role in both woodworking and managing fuel for fire. Though separated by thousands of miles, these communities converged on the same idea, that grinding stone into a tougher edge opened up possibilities not available to earlier flaked technology. The sheer durability of these axes also changed human labour. With flake tools, hunters and gatherers carried bundles of spare flakes, prepared to replace them when they broke. But polished axes shifted the balance. They were heavier, not easily replaced, and often required a stationary place to make and repair them. This encouraged the development of workshops, archaeological sites where unfinished axe blanks, polishing stones and piles of debris indicate repeated use by skilled individuals. In Denmark, quarries of fine-grained stone show evidence of large-scale production, with unfinished axes left at various stages. This points to specialisation, or at least to organised cooperation in producing tools that required time, patience and knowledge. Another dimension is the way polished axes enabled woodworking beyond simple chopping. Flat surfaces could be smoothed, posts squared, and planks split with far greater control. The beginnings of carpentry are hinted at in sites with post-hole arrangements, suggesting timber-framed shelters. Later, Neolithic communities went even further, hollowing out logs to create dugout canoes, objects that changed mobility, trade, and the reach of human groups. Without polished axes, such projects would have been vastly more difficult. The axe thus sits at the root of a chain of innovation that reshaped transport, architecture, and eventually agriculture. Yet, as always, the story is not one of inevitability. Some regions where forests were sparse or softer woods predominated did not adopt polished axes quickly, if at all. The Australian record, for example, shows intermittent use of ground tools depending on ecological needs. This underlines an important truth. Technology spreads not simply because it is better, but because it fits a particular niche. The polished axe was revolutionary in some settings and less relevant in others. Its spread was shaped by environment, not destiny. So when we ask why people began grinding stone when chipping had worked for so long, the answer lies partly in the trees that grew, the spaces that closed in, and the ambitions of communities to make those spaces livable. The axe is a symbol of adaptation, of humans turning not away from their environment but directly against it, cutting, shaping, and remaking it to suit their needs. It was the first truly landscape-altering tool, a quiet herald of the transformations that the Neolithic would bring. When grass was just grass, there was little reason to cut it. Animals grazed, fires burned across plains, and people walked past tall stalks without much thought. But around 12,000 years ago in the Levant, a remarkable shift began. Certain grasses were not merely scenery, they were food. Barley and wild einkorn, growing in dense patches across the Fertile Crescent, carried within their seeds a store of calories richer than nearly any other wild plant. To gather them efficiently, people required a new tool. A sharp flint blade for cutting meat or hide was poorly suited for slicing through the pliant stems of cereal stalks. The innovation was to embed small flaked pieces of stone, microliths, into a handle, arranging them in a row like the teeth of a saw. This composite tool, a sickle, left behind a unique trace, a sheen called silica gloss, formed by the repeated cutting of grass rich in phytoliths. Archaeologists first recognized this gloss when examining Natufian sites in Israel and Jordan. Blades with polished edges, gleaming differently from other tools, betrayed their use as harvesters. The gloss was not decorative but functional wear, a microscopic mirror of repetitive cutting. From these sickles we can infer not just that people gathered wild cereals, but that they gathered them often, and in quantities sufficient to leave permanent marks on stone. In other words, the sickle tells us of intensification, of a deliberate shift toward reliance on grasses as a staple food. This shift was not yet farming. Natufian people still lived by a mix of hunting gazelle, gathering nuts, and fishing along river valleys. But the sickle represents the first step toward transforming landscapes into fields. By repeatedly returning to the same patches of wild grain, humans began a quiet experiment in managing plants, whether they realized it or not. Stalks cut before seeds fully dropped would scatter fewer grains, encouraging growth closer to camp. Over years, people unwittingly favoured cereals that held onto their seeds longer, the first unconscious step toward domestication. Without sickles, this selective pressure would have been impossible to sustain. The design of the early sickles varied, but the principle was consistent. In some cases, tiny blades were set into grooves in a wooden or bone handle, secured with bitumen or resin. Others used longer blades, snapped from a prepared core to create a continuous edge. Both types show heavy silica gloss, indicating that they were used over long periods. In the Jordan Valley, caches of discarded sickle blades show signs of resharpening and replacement, evidence of communities invested in long-term harvesting. The sickle was not a disposable tool, but one maintained season after season, much like polished axes in forested regions. By the early Neolithic, around 10,000 years ago, sickles spread widely across the Fertile Crescent. In Sayonu and Jericho, entire toolkits for harvesting appear, suggesting grain had become central to diet. Beyond the Near East, similar tools emerged wherever grasses became targets. In the Nile Valley, blades with gloss indicate cutting reeds, and possibly cereals along floodplains. In Europe, as cereal crops spread with migrating farmers, sickles followed. Their form adapted to local materials, sometimes bone handles, sometimes antler, but always with the same characteristic row of sharp inserts. The sickle also had a social dimension. At Hilazon Tahtit, a Natufian burial site, archaeologists uncovered carefully placed sickle blades among grave goods, hinting that harvesting had symbolic or status significance. A tool for cutting grass became a marker of identity, perhaps even of wealth. To control the means of harvesting was to control access to food, an idea that would only grow stronger in the millennia to come. The adoption of the sickle reshaped daily life. Foraging had often been opportunistic, following seasonal availability. With sickles, people invested in scheduled harvests, returning to fields at specific times. This demanded planning, storage, and cooperative labour, cutting and bundling stalks, transporting them back to camp, and preparing them for processing required effort far beyond plucking berries or digging tubers. The sickle was therefore more than a tool, it was a commitment to a new rhythm of life. It is worth reflecting on how small an invention it seems. A stone blade set in wood, sharpened by use, worn shiny by stalks of grass. Yet from such modest beginnings grew a revolution. The sickle gave humans the ability to capture the energy of landscapes in concentrated form. It blurred the line between gathering and cultivation, and in doing so, it set the stage for one of the most dramatic shifts in human history. The move from foraging to farming. What counted as food changed, and with it, what counted as essential technology. Without sickles, wild cereals might have remained a supplement, never tipping the balance toward domestication. With them, humans stepped into a future where grasses would no longer be mere backdrop, but the very foundation of civilization. The true importance of the sickle becomes clearer when we consider how it shaped human mobility. Before its invention, groups could move freely from one hunting ground to another, consuming plants opportunistically along the way. The reliance on sickles, however, tied communities more closely to patches of land where cereals grew in abundance. It was not yet agriculture, but it was tethering. Archaeological layers in the Levant show repeated reoccupation of the same sites, with sickle blades discarded in successive phases, each with its own telltale sheen of use. This return to favoured harvesting zones suggests that people were beginning to think of certain landscapes not as temporary stops, but as seasonal homes. Sickles also transformed the tempo of subsistence. Instead of gathering sporadically, harvest became concentrated in a narrow seasonal window. This demanded collective labour, multiple hands working quickly to reap stalks before they shattered and seeds scattered. Evidence from storage pits appearing alongside sickle assemblages indicates that surplus was gathered. With storage came the ability to smooth out the uncertainties of lean months, but also the need to defend those stores. The sickle, therefore, indirectly contributed to the rise of social differentiation and the need for more formalised community structures. The microscopic traces on sickle blades provide a surprisingly detailed glimpse into ancient behaviour. Useware studies distinguish between cutting wild cereals and cutting reeds or grasses for mats and thatching. Some Natufian sites show dual-use sickles, employed for both food and material culture. Bundles of reeds harvested with sickles may have been woven into baskets, or mats used to carry grain, forming a technological partnership between harvesting and storage. It is humbling to realise that one simple tool could ripple through so many aspects of daily life, from diet to housing to social rituals. The geographic spread of sickle technology highlights its adaptability. In Central Europe, early farmers carried the concept with them as they expanded along the Danube corridor. At sites like linear band ceramic settlements, sickle blades appear in great numbers, often carefully resharpened, showing that the habit of cereal harvesting had become fully ingrained. In the Nile Valley, as mentioned, the sickle was equally vital, but the context differed. Floodplain agriculture required reaping not just cereals, but also reeds for construction. Meanwhile, in the Indian subcontinent, evidence of early sickle gloss hints at the cutting of wild grasses long before domesticated millet and rice entered the picture. Each region used the tool in its own way, but the underlying principle remained universal. Sickles were the bridge between opportunistic gathering and systematic harvesting. There is also an aesthetic side to these tools that should not be overlooked. Some sickle handles were carefully shaped, decorated with incised lines, or made from prized animal bone or antler. This suggests that sickles were more than utilitarian, they carried meaning. In societies where the harvest determined survival, it is easy to imagine the sickle as a symbol of sustenance, power, or even ritual. Later agricultural societies would immortalize the sickle as a cultural emblem, a legacy perhaps seeded in these earlier Neolithic practices. One fascinating detail often underappreciated is the ergonomics of early sickles. Handles were designed to fit comfortably in the hand, angled to maximize leverage during cutting. Experimental archaeology, where replicas are used to harvest wild cereals, has shown just how effective they could be, capable of cutting swaths of stalks quickly without excessive strain. This design efficiency, refined through trial and error, reveals the deep empirical knowledge embedded in what might appear to us as simple technology. As humans grew increasingly reliant on cereals, the sickle became not just a harvesting tool, but the first link in a chain of processing technologies. Bundled stalks required threshing, then winnowing, then grinding. Each step would lead to new inventions, but it all began with the ability to cut efficiently. Without sickles, the cycle could not have started. In reflecting on this innovation, we might ask a deceptively simple question. How do you cut grass when grass becomes food? The sickle was the answer, and in that answer lay the first glimpse of agriculture, surplus, and eventually civilization itself. What began as a glossy sheen on flint became the glint of an entirely new human world. Cutting grass was only the beginning. A bundle of stalks carried back to camp may have been food in potential, but it was still stubbornly locked away behind husks and hard grains. Chewing raw barley or einkorn is possible, but it delivers little energy and much toothache. The calories that could sustain entire communities were hidden within, waiting for release. The breakthrough was not only harvesting, but grinding. To crack the grain, crush it, and transform it into digestible flour or meal required a new family of tools: querns, mortars, pestles, and grinding slabs. These devices were heavy, awkward to transport, and entirely unlike the light flakes or microliths of mobile foragers. Their emergence signalled a profound change. People were beginning to invest in stationary technologies, in stones that stayed put and reshaped daily diets. The archaeological record of grinding technology stretches back tens of thousands of years, long before farming, but the Neolithic sees an explosion in both variety and intensity of use. Mortars carved from basalt in the Natufian Levant bear deep wear scars from repeated pounding of seeds and nuts. Some are portable, bowl-shaped, perhaps used by households on the move. Others are massive, immovable stones sunk into the floors of semi-permanent dwellings. Pestles made of smooth river cobbles show polish, where hands grip them and ends battered from thousands of strikes. Usewear analysis reveals starch grains trapped in crevices, microscopic ghosts of the meals once prepared. Barley, legumes, acorns and lentils all make appearances, showing that grinding tools were not limited to cereals but expanded culinary options in every direction. By 10,000 years ago, saddle querns became common. These were elongated slabs with a shallow groove worn down the middle, used by rubbing a handstone back and forth. Unlike pounding in a mortar, this sliding action gradually reduced kernels to fine flour. The repetitive motion left not only grooves in stone, but also grooves in human skeletons. Osteological studies of Neolithic women in the Levant and Europe reveal distinctive patterns of arthritis in shoulders and elbows, the bodily imprint of long hours spent grinding. These traces remind us that technology always comes with labour. A quern did not free people from effort, it required it. But in exchange it made grains nourishing, turning indigestible seeds into the foundation of bread and porridge. The permanence of grinding stones also altered the rhythm of daily life. Whereas a flint knife could be carried in a pouch and used anywhere, a basalt mortar weighing several kilograms tied people to particular spots. This tethering is reflected in archaeology. Clusters of grinding equipment mark household areas within villages, sometimes passed down across generations. A quern was not just a tool, it was furniture, part of the architecture of domestic life. When abandoned, many were left in place, too heavy to move, silent markers of where people once prepared meals. Some were even ritually killed by breaking them before deposition, as if acknowledging their intimate role in human sustenance. The spread of grinding technology across regions shows remarkable convergence. In North Africa, mortars from Capsian sites attest to early seed processing before the arrival of domesticated crops. In Europe, querns arrive alongside the first farmers from the Near East, spreading along the Danube and into the Mediterranean. In East Asia, grinding slabs from the early Holocene were used to process wild millet and tubers, long before rice cultivation. The same basic solution, crush, grind, release calories, was reinvented wherever plants with edible seeds formed a reliable food source. What makes grinding stones so important is not just their utility, but the cascade of consequences they set in motion. By enabling the regular consumption of grains, they locked communities into cycles of sowing, harvesting, processing, and eating. They encouraged storage, since processed flour could be preserved longer than raw stalks. They changed gendered divisions of labour, with grinding often falling disproportionately on women, shaping social structures in ways archaeologists are only beginning to unravel. And they laid the foundation for culinary traditions that persist to this day. Every loaf of bread, every bowl of porridge, every dumpling or flatbread owes its existence to those first querns worn smooth by human hands. The haunting question, of course, is whether grinding was liberation or burden. It allowed larger populations to be fed, villages to grow, and civilizations to rise. Yet it also anchored people to monotonous labour and dependence on a narrow set of foods. Was this progress, or was it the beginning of a trap? The stones cannot answer, but their grooves whisper of both resilience and constraint, of bodies bent over slabs day after day, grinding the future into being. The role of grinding stones becomes even more striking when we think about the sensory world they created. Imagine the soundscape of a Neolithic settlement, the rhythmic scraping of querns, the dull pounding of pestles, the constant hum of effort. These were not background noises, but defining features of daily life. In some villages, dozens of households may have worked side by side, creating a collective percussion that marked time as surely as church bells would in medieval towns. Archaeologists have even speculated that the repetitive motions and sounds of grinding might have fostered a kind of meditative rhythm, binding households and communities together through shared labour. Archaeological residues extend beyond the stones themselves. The dust created by grinding filled homes and lungs, and dental remains from Neolithic skeletons often show significant wear, with enamel ground down by tiny fragments of stone accidentally consumed in bread or porridge. The gritty meals were nourishing but abrasive, reshaping teeth and shortening lifespans of molars. Yet these costs were endured because the nutritional payoff was immense. A kilogram of grain, when milled, could sustain a family for days, while the same weight in gathered fruits or hunted meat required far more energy and luck to obtain. Grinding stones thus turned the gamble of subsistence into something closer to routine. Beyond food, mortars and querns also processed pigments and minerals. Red ochre residues on some tools suggest they were used not only for meals, but for rituals, painting, or body adornment. In this sense, grinding was not merely about calories, but about culture. The same motion that turned barley into flour could also turn hematite into powder, for decorating walls, tools, or bodies. Grinding tools therefore operated at the boundary between the practical and the symbolic, bridging nourishment and meaning. Regional innovations also highlight how communities adapted grinding technology to their environments. In the basalt-rich Levant, Durable volcanic stone provided mortars that could last generations. In Europe, sandstone and granite were more common, producing different wear patterns and requiring replacement more often. In East Asia, early grinding slabs used for millet reveal subtle shifts in diet long before full agricultural systems emerged. Even in the Americas, independent traditions of grinding stones for maize and other crops developed millennia later, showing that this was a technological solution that humanity reinvented wherever seeds and tubers became staples. There is also the question of scale. At first, grinding was an individual or household task, but as villages expanded, so did the volume of grain to be processed. This pressure may have driven the eventual invention of rotary querns in later millennia, an early form of mechanization. But during the Neolithic, the saddle quern and mortar dominated, with their labour demands shaping daily schedules. In a sense, these stones were the first machines humans built for food processing. Machines powered not by water or animals, but by human backs and arms. When archaeologists excavate abandoned Neolithic houses, grinding stones are often the heaviest and most enduring artefacts left behind. Unlike flint blades, which are easily removed or recycled, querns frequently remain in situ. They are sometimes found cracked or deliberately buried, as if households acknowledged their symbolic weight in daily survival. To leave a grinding stone behind was to leave a piece of the household itself, a relic of meals eaten, children raised, and labour shared. And so, as much as polished axes cleared forests and sickles harvested crops, it was the grinding stone that truly transformed diet into cuisine and calories into stability. Without querns and mortars, cereals would have remained stubborn husks, of limited use in sustaining dense populations. With them, human communities stepped firmly into a new era of food security, albeit one tied to daily toil. The grooves etched into stone are grooves etched into history, reminding us that progress often comes not with sudden leaps, but with steady, grinding persistence. If you wanted to plant something in the soil 10,000 years ago, before bronze or iron, what exactly did you reach for? Hands alone could not cut through dense earth. Fingers were quick to blister, and bones were far too fragile for repeated digging. The answer was to extend the hand with wood, and then to harden that extension with stone. From this deceptively simple union of natural materials came the earliest hoes and adzes, the first implements for shaping not only landscapes but futures. Archaeologists often emphasize the primacy of hunting weapons, yet the quiet tools of cultivation are just as revolutionary. In many sites from the Levant to East Asia, the charred remains of wooden digging sticks have been found, sometimes with tips rounded smooth by repeated plunges into soil. These sticks were not merely improvised. Some were hardened in fire, others tipped with flaked stone to increase cutting power. They could break apart packed clay, open small holes for seeds, or lift edible roots from the earth. In the tropics and subtropics, similar forms persisted for millennia, proving that simplicity can be as enduring as sophistication. The stone adze marked another leap. Unlike the axe, which struck downward to fell a tree, the adze had its blade set crosswise to the handle. This gave it a scooping motion, perfect for scraping soil or shaping wood. When fitted to strong wooden shafts, these tools could pry apart compact ground, aerate soil, or remove stumps and roots that stood in the way of early cultivation plots. Ethnographic parallels from Oceania and Africa remind us how versatile such tools can be. With one implement, a person could dig, scrape, smooth and chop, moving seamlessly between tasks. Evidence of these early earthworking tools is often indirect. Stone blades of adzes, polished to withstand stress, survive far better than their wooden handles, where analysis on their edges reveals striations consistent with digging in gritty soils or cutting fibrous roots. In some Neolithic villages, concentrations of adze blades suggest communal work, perhaps clearing ground for early crops like barley or pulses. The heavy wear on many specimens also implies long use lives, their surfaces resharpened again and again until the tool shrank to a fraction of its original size. The adoption of hoes and adzes altered not just diets, but ecosystems. Where digging sticks first opened soil for wild seeds, adzes soon cleared patches of woodland to allow more sunlight for useful plants. This was not yet full-scale farming, but a kind of ecological editing. nudging certain species forward while holding others back. In Southeast Asia, evidence suggests that adzes were used not only in cultivation, but also in shaping timber for longhouses and canoes, indicating that these tools stood at the intersection of agriculture and settlement. The physical effort involved cannot be understated. Unlike a plough pulled by animals, every stroke of a hoe or adze demanded human muscle. Yet this very effort reveals a shift in human priorities. The return was no longer immediate, as it was with foraging or hunting. Instead, people were willing to invest labour into landscapes for food that might only appear weeks or months later. The hoe was, in this sense, a tool of faith. Faith that effort now would yield sustenance later, that shaping the earth could shape survival. Adzes also had symbolic weight. In some burials from the European Neolithic, finely polished adze blades were placed beside the dead, suggesting they were markers of status or identity. Perhaps those who wielded them were remembered not only as workers, but as shapers of land and society. In Polynesian traditions, adzes centuries later became imbued with spiritual power, associated with creation itself. It is tempting, though cautious, to imagine similar sentiments reaching back into the deep past, where the first strokes of stone against soil may have carried meanings beyond the merely practical. By the end of the 10th millennium BCE, hoes and adzes were quietly transforming human life. They did not shout their presence like spear points or arrowheads, but they left enduring signatures in the landscapes humans altered. Every tilled patch of soil, every smoothed plank for shelter, bore witness to the leverage these tools gave against the stubbornness of earth. Without them, the leap from gathering to cultivating might never have been possible. With them, humans began not just to live on the land, but to live from land they had themselves remade. The deeper we look into the record, the more hoes and adzes reveal not only their functional role, but also the scale of collective labour that surrounded them. A single digging stick could feed a family, but clearing woodland or creating small cultivation plots demanded many hands working together. Archaeological surveys in Central Europe and Southwest Asia have uncovered evidence of deliberate clearings where charcoal deposits mix with adze fragments, hinting at coordinated group activity. It is difficult to imagine these efforts being solitary. Rather, they must have been moments of cooperation, where whole kin groups carved new niches out of stubborn ground. What makes these implements fascinating is their dual nature. They were both multi-purpose and highly adaptable to local environments. In low soils of the Near East, lighter adzes sufficed, their thin, polished blades skimming through soft deposits. In volcanic regions like Japan or Mesoamerica, heavier, broader adzes were crafted to withstand the punishment of rocky terrain. In wetlands, digging sticks took on yet another function, pulling up tubers, reeds, and other resources as important as cereals. Each landscape demanded a unique response, and the toolkit shifted accordingly, suggesting that innovation was not a one-time leap but an ongoing dialogue with place. Useware studies under microscopes have even allowed researchers to distinguish between adzes used for woodworking and those used for earth-moving. On some specimens, microscopic polish indicates long hours cutting fibrous vegetation, while others show edge fractures typical of digging against stones. This means communities likely maintained sets of tools dedicated to different tasks, a form of specialization that anticipates later agricultural economies. These small technological distinctions signal a growing sophistication in how people organize their labor and allocated resources. Another underappreciated element is maintenance. Stone adzes, especially polished ones, could not simply be discarded at the first sign of dullness. Archaeologists find resharpening flakes scattered across habitation sites, clear evidence of ongoing care. These tools were valuable enough to justify repeated investment of time and effort, and in some cases they may have been passed from generation to generation. The life of a single adze could therefore span decades, carrying with it the memory of countless hours of human labour. If we pause for a moment, it is striking that these simple objects were humanity's first serious attempt at engineering the ground beneath our feet. Spears and knives had always worked against living creatures, but hoes and adzes worked against the earth itself. They marked the moment when humans began not only to harvest what nature offered, but to intervene directly in the cycles of soil and plant life. And that intervention, humble as it first seemed, would eventually underpin all the complex societies that followed. In that sense, every polished adze fragment found in a field is not just a relic of work, but a symbol of a profound philosophical shift. For perhaps the first time, humans acted with the confidence that landscapes could be reshaped to fit their needs. It was the quiet beginning of an idea that still defines us, that the ground is not only where we walk, but also something we can mould, one stroke at a time. When we think of the Neolithic, it is tempting to picture fields of grain or herds of goats, but just as transformative was the turn toward shaping wood and building structures that endured more than a single season. For much of prehistory, shelters had been ephemeral, tents of hide, brush huts, or lean-tos quickly abandoned as groups moved on. But by around 10,000 years ago, people began leaving behind post holes, charred timbers, and traces of carpentry that reveal a new ambition, homes that could stand for years, even generations. This shift was possible only because stone tools evolved into instruments capable of cutting and shaping wood with precision. Polished adzes are the clearest example. These tools, with their ground stone blades mounted at right angles to wooden handles, were fundamentally different from flaked cutting edges of earlier times. By grinding and polishing the edge, Neolithic carpenters achieved a sharper, more durable surface that could slice into timber rather than splinter it. This was not just a minor improvement, but a complete reimagining of what could be done with wood. Archaeologists working at sites like Lepenski Vir on the Danube or Sattelhoek in Anatolia have uncovered timbers shaped with remarkable regularity, suggesting repeated blows by tools designed specifically for carpentry. The evidence of post holes provides another layer of proof. When timber posts rot away, they leave darker circular stains in the soil where they once stood. Entire floor plans of Neolithic houses can sometimes be reconstructed from these negative traces. Rectangular homes appear in many early villages, a radical departure from the rounded shelters of the Paleolithic. These straight walls and right-angled corners required beams cut to specific lengths, flattened on one side and fitted together. This is carpentry, not improvisation, and carpentry implies tools like chisels and adzes capable of shaping joints, trimming planks, and smoothing surfaces. Excavations in northern Europe, such as at the site of Starkar in England, show that woodworking traditions were already emerging even in Mesolithic contexts. But it is in the Neolithic that timber architecture truly takes hold. Houses grew larger, often with multiple rooms, hearths, and storage spaces. This required a new relationship with the surrounding forest. Entire groves were managed, cut, and regrown to supply beams and posts. The toolkits found alongside these dwellings often include dozens of polished adzes, suggesting that woodworking had become a core task in the daily rhythm of the community. The design of these houses also reveals a subtle but profound shift in human thinking. By investing labour into cutting and shaping wood, people anchored themselves in place. A house with fitted timbers could not be casually abandoned. It was a stake in the landscape, a commitment to permanence. The architectural remains of Jericho, for instance, include evidence of substantial timber reinforcements for early stone walls. Elsewhere, in the forests of Central Europe, the first longhouses stretched up to 30 metres in length, each requiring immense quantities of lumber. Without polished adzes and chisels, such feats would have been unimaginable. We can also glimpse the artistry of woodworking in smaller finds: bowls carved from solid logs, handles shaped for comfort, beams polished to a sheen that speaks of pride as well as utility. The line between tool and furniture blurred, and wood became a material not just for shelter, but for expression. Every cut and groove tells us that Neolithic people were no longer content merely to use what nature provided. They wanted to reshape it to suit their vision. The question lingers: when did humans become carpenters? Perhaps the answer lies not in a single invention, but in a growing confidence. By the early Holocene, people no longer just lived within nature's architecture of caves and forests. With adze in hand, they had begun to build their own, leaving behind timber frames that still whisper across millennia of soil. What also becomes clear when studying Neolithic woodworking is that these new techniques went hand in hand with social change. To build a large timber house or communal structure required not only sharp adzes, but also organised labour. Felling a tree, shaping its trunk into usable beams, and transporting the timbers to a building site could not be done by a single individual. These projects imply coordinated groups, perhaps family units or entire villages working in concert. The remains of early longhouses in Central Europe, sometimes stretching nearly 30 metres, make this point undeniable. Their scale demanded both technical planning and collective effort, suggesting that architecture was as much about community as it was about shelter. Experimental archaeology has given us a vivid insight into how such woodworking might have looked and felt. Modern researchers using replica polished adzes have shown that cutting down a medium-sized oak is entirely feasible, though it takes many hours of steady work. The polished edge bites into the wood with far greater efficiency than flaked stone ever could, and once the trunk is felled, the same tools can smooth surfaces or hollow out troughs. In the process, the user builds a rhythm, each swing followed by a splintering crack, slowly turning raw forest into usable timber. These reconstructions remind us that every Neolithic house we uncover was once built by hands blistered and muscles aching, with weeks of effort embedded in every beam. There is also evidence that woodworking extended beyond simple construction. At sites in Scandinavia and the Baltic, archaeologists have unearthed wooden fish traps and weirs, precisely fitted with mortises and pegs shaped by chisels. These indicate a sophisticated understanding of joinery, where pieces of wood had to interlock in functional designs. In river valleys and marshlands, such wooden structures may have been as important to survival as the houses themselves, securing steady food supplies of fish and waterfowl. Here again, the adze and chisel proved indispensable, enabling techniques that prefigure carpentry traditions we recognise in much later historical periods. Another striking feature is the symbolic dimension attached to wooden architecture. Timber posts often appear in burial contexts, sometimes set upright beside graves, or forming part of mortuary structures. This suggests that woodworking was not purely utilitarian, but had ritual significance as well. Wood could frame not only the houses of the living, but also the spaces of the dead, linking everyday labour with cosmological ideas. The care taken to shape and place these posts reflects a reverence for timber as a medium that bridged the practical and the sacred. Ultimately, the move into carpentry during the Neolithic reveals a critical step in the human story. By shaping wood, people reshaped their relationship with permanence, community, and even memory. The polished adze was not merely a sharper tool, it was the key that unlocked the architecture of settled life. And once humans learned to fashion homes from trees, the forest was never again just a backdrop to survival. It became the raw material of culture itself. What also becomes clear when studying Neolithic woodworking is that these new techniques went hand in hand with social change. To build a large timber house or communal structure required not only sharp adzes, but also organised labour. Felling a tree, shaping its trunk into usable beams, and transporting the timbers to a building site could not be done by a single individual. These projects imply coordinated groups, perhaps family units or entire villages, working in concert. The remains of early longhouses in Central Europe, sometimes stretching nearly 30 metres, make this point undeniable. Their scale demanded both technical planning and collective effort, suggesting that architecture was as much about community as it was about shelter. Experimental archaeology has given us a vivid insight into how such woodworking might have looked and felt. Modern researchers using replica polished adzes have shown that cutting down a medium-sized oak is entirely feasible, though it takes many hours of steady work. The polished edge bites into the wood with far greater efficiency than flaked stone ever could, and once the trunk is felled, the same tools can smooth surfaces or hollow out troughs. In the process, the user builds a rhythm, each swing followed by a splintering crack, slowly turning raw forest into usable timber. These reconstructions remind us that every Neolithic house we uncover was once built by hands blistered and muscles aching, with weeks of effort embedded in every beam. There is also evidence that woodworking extended beyond simple construction. At sites in Scandinavia and the Baltic, archaeologists have unearthed wooden fish traps and weirs, precisely fitted with mortises and pegs shaped by chisels. These indicate a sophisticated understanding of joinery, where pieces of wood had to interlock in functional designs. In river valleys and marshlands, such wooden structures may have been as important to survival as the houses themselves, securing steady food supplies of fish and waterfowl. Here again, The adze and chisel proved indispensable, enabling techniques that prefigure carpentry traditions we recognise in much later historical periods. Another striking feature is the symbolic dimension attached to wooden architecture. Timber posts often appear in burial contexts, sometimes set upright beside graves, or forming part of mortuary structures. This suggests that woodworking was not purely utilitarian, but had ritual significance as well. Wood could frame not only the houses of the living, but also the spaces of the dead, linking everyday labour with cosmological ideas. The care taken to shape and place these posts reflects a reverence for timber as a medium that bridged the practical and the sacred. Ultimately, the move into carpentry during the Neolithic reveals a critical step in the human story. By shaping wood, people reshaped their relationship with permanence, community, and even memory. The polished adze was not merely a sharper tool, it was the key that unlocked the architecture of settled life. And once humans learned to fashion homes from trees, the forest was never again just a backdrop to survival. It became the raw material of culture itself. When we think about the Stone Age toolkit, our minds usually leap to axes, sickles, and grinding stones, durable artifacts that have survived for thousands of years in soil and sediment. Yet much of the prehistoric toolkit was made of materials that almost never endure. Cords of twisted plant fibres, nets woven from reeds, baskets stitched from grasses, and adhesives made of resin and pitch. These are the hidden technologies, the soft scaffolding of a daily life, without which the more famous stone implements would have been useless. Without a cord, a polished axe blade is just a lump of rock. Without binding, a fishing spear is just a stick. It is here, in the realm of fibres and glues, that the Neolithic toolkit takes on a fuller, more surprising shape. The evidence is rare but compelling. In caves such as Lascaux, impressions of woven mats have been found pressed into clay floors, ghosts of organic materials long since decayed. At the site of Ohalo, too, in Israel, preserved under waterlogged conditions for nearly 23,000 years, archaeologists uncovered twisted fibres and remnants of cordage, proof that humans were making rope long before agriculture. By the Neolithic, these skills must have been widespread, underpinning everything from hafting stone blades to constructing fishing nets large enough to feed entire villages. The fact that we find so little of this material is not evidence of its absence, but of its fragility. Experimental archaeology has been invaluable in reconstructing how these hidden tools were made. By stripping the inner bark from willow or lime trees, soaking it, and twisting it in opposite directions, researchers can produce cordage that is astonishingly strong. Tests show that even thin cords are capable of bearing loads that would surprise us today. A properly woven rope could drag logs for house posts, secure hides into shelters, or bind stones into composite tools. Nets woven with the same techniques can be stretched across streams, corralling fish with minimal effort. It is no exaggeration to say that these technologies multiplied human strength many times over, extending what a community could achieve. Adhesives were another cornerstone of this hidden toolkit. Birch tar, produced by heating bark in low oxygen conditions, has been found on Middle Paleolithic tools and was still in use during the Neolithic. When smeared onto a shaft and heated slightly, the tar creates a bond strong enough to hold stone blades in place, even under heavy stress. Resins from conifers, mixed with ochre or plant fibres, offered similar solutions. Some Neolithic points still preserve traces of these dark, sticky residues, a reminder that chemistry was part of the prehistoric toolkit long before laboratories. Fishing technologies highlight the ingenuity of these organic inventions. From Denmark's Ertebøl culture to Japan's Yomon tradition, archaeologists have found waterlogged stakes and fragments of woven nets that suggest large-scale communal fishing. In some cases, fish bones are found in heaps alongside the stakes, confirming the effectiveness of these traps. Nets allowed people to harvest food on a scale impossible with a single spear or hook, creating surpluses that supported larger, more permanent settlements. Once again, it is not the stone weights that truly mattered, but the cords and knots that bound them together. The symbolic weight of fibre technologies should not be overlooked either. Twisted cords were sometimes impressed into clay to create decorative patterns, foreshadowing pottery designs. Woven mats may have functioned as both flooring and burial coverings, giving texture and dignity to daily life and ritual alike. In these ways, the hidden toolkit was not just practical, but cultural, threading together the fabric of Neolithic societies in the most literal sense. The haunting question is how much we have lost to decay. If a single waterlogged site can reveal cordage, nets, and mats, how many more invisible tools were once everywhere, only to rot into silence? When we look at a museum display of polished axes, we are seeing just the hard skeleton of the Neolithic toolkit. The flesh, woven, twisted, sticky and supple, has mostly vanished. Yet without it, the skeleton would never have stood. When we picture the Stone Age, the very word tricks us into thinking that stone was the only resource our ancestors valued. Yet in truth, many of the sharpest and most versatile tools were not chipped from flint or ground from basalt at all. They were carved from bone, antler, and ivory. These were the softer, more workable materials that turned the remains of animals into the implements of daily life. They carried an advantage that stone often could not. Their natural forms were already close to what people needed, requiring less labour to shape and producing edges that could be honed to a fine, needle-like sharpness. The Stone Age might more honestly be called the age of everything durable, for bone and antler left their traces alongside stone in nearly every Neolithic site. The range of objects crafted from animal parts is remarkable. Awls made from long bones were essential for piercing hides, a task that even the sharpest flint struggles with. The narrow taper of a bone awl slips easily through leather or woven material, allowing early humans to lace, stitch and fasten garments or bags. From awls, it was a short step to needles, often made of bone or ivory, and sometimes complete with carved eyes for threading sinew or plant fibre. The presence of needles suggests clothing not just draped but tailored, with seams, folds and reinforcement, garments that were as much constructed as they were wrapped. Such tailoring, in colder climates especially, would have meant the difference between survival and frostbite. Fishing and hunting likewise leaned heavily on organic materials. Harpoons carved from antler tines or ivory tusks provided barbed edges capable of piercing and holding fast to slippery prey. These multi-pronged weapons were sometimes composite, their barbs detachable to make retrieval easier. The use of antler in particular offered strength and flexibility that stone could not match. Its fibrous structure resisted breaking under stress, making it ideal for repeated thrusts in hunting large aquatic animals. Archaeologists have found caches of such harpoons in sites from Scandinavia to Siberia, suggesting wide adoption and innovation with local animal resources. Bone was also adapted for finer domestic tasks. Spatulas and burnishers carved from ribs helped in smoothing hides during tanning, while polished antler